purposes, needless to say, we're thrilled to have him anyway. And there's more lemon bars and things. At some point during the question period, I will distribute those. So I'm Sharon Clough. I'm the co-director of Phronesis Lab, which is running a series, which Mark Tschaepe is the most recent member participant. The series is Philosopher, Scientist, Citizen, and the series is dedicated to thinking about the role of scientists in society and the role of scientific claims in society and the pressures that society puts on scientists and the ways in which scientists navigate those. And I'm teaching right now a course on it's philosophy and religion. It's a mixed undergraduate graduate course on philosophy. Yeah, so philosophy and religion generally, and then you just pick a topic. So I decided to do neuroscience and religion, and that was handy because I happen to know this guy who could give a great talk on why is neuroscience a thing these days? Why is it the go-to explanation? And he's going to provide you with some a rationale for that. One could come at this in many different ways, but I think the one he's going to come at it with is particularly compelling. So this is Mark Tschaepe. He's from Prairie View, which is in the Texas A&M system, just outside of Houston. I'm warm and I've been running around moving furniture. Am I on video? Have you started?
Oh yeah.
Hey Barbara, that spot is for you. I left it for you. Yeah. So it's a historically black college, and he has many areas of expertise, one of which is African philosophy, and some of you know that he and I attended a conference in African philosophy in Johannesburg, and lots of cool things have come out of that. He and I met, I should say, his dissertation, he did his PhD at Southern Illinois University, and his dissertation was on mechanistic explanations at work, accounting for pragmatic considerations in science and philosophy. And the case study he looked at was how monogamy gets explained neuroscientifically. The claims often then get made about humans, but the model organism is the prairie vole, and right, prairie voles. So Mark knows everything there is to know about the neuroscience of monogamy and prairie voles. I mention that because one of the things he and I share, and one of the reasons why I thought he'd be great for this series, is an appreciation of and a devotion to looking at biomedical research in particular, looking at particular case studies, and what are the pragmatic considerations that underlie the decisions that get made. They often, the scientists working on those sorts of projects aren't often incentivized to think carefully about those sorts of things, which is why philosophers it's one place we're useful. His most recent project, published in 2014, just last year, came out in the Transactions of the Charles Peirce Society. Just to give you an idea of the kind of careful case study, or another example of the careful case study work he does, is called Guessing and Abduction. Should give it a sexier title, because what it's really about is he got interested, he does all this work on advocacy, works on the board of directors of the AIDS Foundation in Houston, right, AFH? Yeah. Has an interest in HIV/AIDS, got really interested in looking at UCLA Medical School, where the very first cases were being examined in 1981, and was really interested in the ways in which these guys, most of them men, were guessing. And what was the nature of guessing? They weren't making wild guesses. They had very particular sorts of guessing about some areas rather than others. They didn't have a freaking clue about what was going on. It was brand new. How did the HIV/AIDS hypothesis come to the hypothesis it is today? Fantastic essay. All right, a couple of other quick things. So we met just this last May at a conference at the University of Texas at Dallas. I've been in Texas a lot. I never thought I would be connected to Texas as much as I have been recently, where they have a center funded by the government, the state government of Texas, the Center for the Study of Values in Science, Medicine, and Technology. I would love a center like that here. I'm just throwing that out there. And Mark gave a talk called Noxious, actually, it's very similar. I asked you to give it here again too. So the one he gave here was a noxious injustice as punishment, prisoner sexual violence, toxic masculinity, and then looking at ways in which African philosophy can provide a set of tools to help address toxic masculinity as it's expressed in prison sexual violence. So he came back this summer as a Phronesis Scholar in Residence and gave a presentation on that material. He also did another presentation this summer called The Student as Philosopher Scientist. And we brought in faculty and administrators from College Hill High School for, it's an alternative program just a couple blocks that way, for at-risk youth. That the principal was so impressed by that talk, he's now made students as philosopher scientists the model of how he's organizing the pedagogical goals for the high school for this year. And he's writing a grant to bring Mark back and run a workshop for their faculty. So it's been a really nice bridging. The Phronesis Lab is coming to fruition, the sorts of things we wanted to do. So today he's going to give a talk, Quantifying Experience, the Seduction of Neuroscientific Explanation in the Dopamine Democracy, a very compelling, much more compelling than your one on guessing. I'll just let you do your thing. It's my pleasure. Please join me.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I appreciate everybody being here. This is an incredibly impressive crowd, although I know that many of you were compelled to be here. I was thinking about it. I don't know if it should be the seduction of neuroscientific explanation. It might really, the preposition might be the seduction by neuroscientific explanation, but I haven't quite decided yet. It's not that important. The most important thing right now is to tell you what dopamine democracy is, because that's a really sexy phrase, I think. And dopamine democracy is a general system. I define it as a general system or pattern of behavior in which persons are generally of the belief that they make free choices that directly contribute to governance. All right, so it's this belief that we have some kind of say in the things that go on. Now, what makes it dopamine democracy? What am I talking about, and how did I even get to this phrase? Well, first of all, we have this belief in volitional decisions, in part because we get this immediate feeling of anticipation, and then we get a momentary reward when we make a choice, like when we like something on Facebook, right? It feels really good to like something, or when we post something and someone else likes it, we think, I did a good job, I made a choice, and I'm actually contributing to the world. Or if somebody retweets something that we tweet, right? I mean, that's incredibly impressive. Like, I don't know if anybody else in here is a comic book fan. Is anybody? Okay, so does anybody know, it's like the most brilliant comic right now. It's considered like a feminist comic, Bitch Planet. Does anybody? Okay, you should all be reading it. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a brilliant, brilliant comic about this women's prison. And it's like these feminists are writing it, and like people are getting tattoos that say non-compliance, and like people in the world. And there's like a controversy about this because there are all these people who are like, you know, yeah, non-compliance, right? And I had posted this little thing on Twitter that said like, this comic is brilliant, you know, and one of the illustrators retweeted it, and I was like, oh, you know, I mean, it was like, you know, from the heavens, the Twitter gods and goddesses had affirmed me in the dopamine democracy. So the illusion of choice is also facilitated by the market of options. We have all these channels, right? So we can choose from any number of things. We have so many choices that we make that contribute to our freedom. Now, the way that I came along this little phrase, dopamine democracy, was actually from Plato. And I love teaching Plato's Republic, and I can talk about the Republic forever. But today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Book 8. In Book 8 of the Republic, which if those of you who haven't read it recently, you should go back because it's really prescient, because this is stuff that's actually happening now. Plato presents this really stark version of democracy, wherein democracy is based on just choice, just freedom and variation. And somehow, freedom and variation appear to be the best possible way to live, all right? And he talks about how people who live in this democracy, if you remember, those of you who have read the Republic, I'll just give you a quick cursory, you know, view of this.
he and his interlocutors are constructing this ideal city by which they can find justice, but in book 8 is when things get real, because Plato says all good things have to come to an end, and so they're like, what would happen? And the fact is that the rulers of the city would not abide by the reproduction laws exactly, and so there's devolution of the city, and so it goes through these various iterations, democracy, oligarchy, and then it hits democracy, okay? And in democracy, Plato is like, this is what people think is beautiful because they have all these choices and they're free, or at least they think they're free. But they're not really free. Because, as he says, and I'm actually going to read this because I love this quotation so much, he says, they aren't filled with, and plus maybe this will get some of you to be like, oh yeah, Republic. They aren't filled with that which really is and never taste any stable or pure pleasure. Because they're always shopping around for something new. Instead, they always look down at the ground like cattle, and with their heads bent over the dinner table, they feed, fatten, and fornicate. Those are the 3 F's. We're all familiar with them. For the part that they're trying to fill is like a vessel full of holes, and neither it nor the things they are trying to fill it with are among the things that are. And whenever I read this, I think of the day after Thanksgiving and shopping, which is really about feed, fattening, and fornicating, let's face it. So what about the democratic citizens who believe that they are happy? Well, they're really just driven by the freedom to consume. It's not actual freedom, it's just the freedom to choose more stuff that's available to them. And as Plato says, extreme freedom can't be expected to lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery. And this actually in the Republic happens because democracy is the penultimate stage of government. In fact, the next constitution is tyranny, which is what the Republic inevitably falls into. So, how does Plato relate to dopamine democracy? Well, I've taken this conception of democracy, and he talks about this kind of stark, post-apocalyptic democracy, and coupled it with the current tools of consumption. This constitutes the dopamine democracy. So if you think about it, it's kind of like Plato meets online shopping, okay? Dopamine democracy is driven by a belief in extreme freedom that culminates in every facet of life being based upon consumption and expectation. This is the inside joke about dopamine. There are all of these recent studies about how people love checking their phones because we get that little bump of dopamine, if you will. We get this little spike of dopamine, which is a little spike of both happiness and expectation, supposedly. So freedom for the citizen is seemingly permitted by the freedom of the market of consumption, or the market of possibilities. So when I'm talking about dopamine democracy, I'm really talking about how individuals are interacting with their environment and the way that they come to believe that they are free and they come to expect freedom. But dopamine democracy fits very nicely and is actually perpetuated within the framework of what's known as neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is a term that's been thrown around a lot, especially since the 1980s, but recently it's been talked about, I think, even more thoroughly by people who are doing work in philosophy as well as different avenues of political or socioeconomic theory. So David Harvey provides a nice definition in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, and in essence, neoliberalism is the idea that everything should be driven by the market, that at bottom, what's important is personal autonomy and that the market be as free as possible, or that markets be as free as possible, and that we can assert ourselves and be truly autonomous, free individuals within the market, as long as the market is unfettered. So the guiding ethic that he claims is that the social goodwill is maximized by maximizing the reach and frequency of market transactions. Everything becomes available stuff, becomes an available choice that we can engage in. We have the freedom. We're these atomic individuals who have the freedom to choose to change the channel or to keep the channel the same. We can choose to go to the mall or we can choose to shop online. That becomes the very basis of identity and value within neoliberalism. So with regard to the way that we live in a neoliberalist system, Wendy Brown this year came out with a brilliant book called Undoing the Demos. She says the market becomes the rather than a site of verediction. Verediction being a site of truth, a site by which things are true. and becomes so for every arena. This is important. Every arena becomes part of that market. So all values become based on market principles, not merely the values of objects that are typically seen as objects of consumption. So not your traditional objects of consumption, but everything becomes based upon market principles. Brown states the market principles frame every sphere, and I love this, from mothering to mating, from learning to criminality, from planning one's family to planning one's death. They all fit within the purview of the market. They all fit within that frame. And so all of the explanations that we have for phenomena must also fit within that frame. Okay? So explanations have to somehow mold to the notion of market principles, of the idea of transactions and transactive value. In order for explanations to fit the market frame, classifications are actually altered. And those of you who work in academia like I do will recognize this because you have to fill out things about assessment. So groups become stakeholders, right? We don't deal with groups anymore, we deal with the stakeholders. And we no longer deal with laws, because laws sound kind of Kafkaesque, although this is kind of Kafkaesque. They become guidelines, and regulations become standards. Policing no longer occurs, codes of conduct occur, all right? Another term that gets used a lot is benchmarks and benchmarking, right? So all of those things come originally from the language of markets, but notice the other explanatory fields mold to the market language and to market principles. But this question arises. What about behaviors and motivations for behavior that don't really fit into market language? I mean, qualitative language is kind of a problem here if it can't be divided up into market-like categories, right? I mean, if you have all these qualitative things, or qualitative motivations or inspirations or what have you, it's really difficult, or it might be difficult, to fit that into little market boxes, okay? So behaviors can only really be explained according to market principles if they can be quantified as parts and operations. So what we need stuff that's movable and that we can manipulate and that's quantifiable. Well, conveniently enough, we can actually do this with neuroscience. Neuroscience provides mechanistic explanations for a whole slew of behavior that we previously thought was merely qualitative. So what parts and operations do within neuroscience is they provide actual locations by which we can start messing with stuff. If we don't like some behavior, we can start to change it because we know where the gears fit together and we know what, or we think we know, what the gears do, okay? So we strip away the qualitative and it gets replaced by the quantitative, or it gets replaced by the mechanistic, if you will. So for example, the neuroscientific explanations of love provide means by which to quantify, track, and manipulate various parts and operations specifically linked to behaviors that we refer to as love behaviors, okay? Now, we can't just directly go out and start experimenting on people with regard to what's going on in their brains in terms of love, but we've got these great models like little prairie voles that pair bond. And for those of you who don't know what pair bonding is, that's when two mammals, usually birds pair bond as well, but they get together, they mate, and then they remain together effectively for the rest of their lives, or at least a really long time, right? Until one of them dies, or, you know, there's a dispute about what to watch on television. Something. But anyway, prairie voles are this great model. By the way, I was thinking as I was working on this slide, this is related, but I just have to throw this out here because I've always wondered about this and it kind of struck me. That I think that there's an experience, the experience of falling in love always happens too soon. Like anybody who falls in love, you're like, is it too soon? Like I was trying to think of what, like if you were to quantify the time, right? I think, am I the only one who's experienced this? Where you're like, it hasn't been long enough. Like I think, does everybody go through this? Is it just me? Because I think this is a thing and I want to know more about it. Like when you're falling in love, you're like, what has it been 3 3 weeks? Does it need to be, like, does it have to be 3 months? Does it have to be, like, and soon it's like an absurd amount of time. You're like, is a year long enough? Like, a year's almost too long if you don't know by that. Anyway, that's a non sequitur. Just something I was thinking about when I was constructing this particular slide. All right. So Sue Carter, who's at University of Illinois, she worked with a man named Lowell Getz, who actually got interested in prairie voles and pair bonding because he grew up on a farm in actually in central Illinois near where I grew up. And he was just, as a kid, he was walking along and he would notice that there would be these little prairie voles who would be nesting with one another, and they would always nest with the same mates. And so he got intrigued by why this was and ended up building a career out of it. And then his student, Sue Carter, ended up building a really, really impressive career about it and is still doing stuff on prairie voles and neuroendocrinology. So there are these explanations that they started coming up with that are associated with love and are really popular in the press, by the way. You cannot go onto the New York Times website any week without seeing something on oxytocin and vasopressin. Trust me, as somebody who's done work on this, it's all over the New York Times. It's there every single week, and you get these really obnoxious articles. Like, notice, The Economist, right? I get a kick out of you. I love this. Scientists are finding that after all, they're like, I mean, come on. After all, love really is down to a chemical addiction between people. And then there's this, Sherry Clough and I both have a lot of criticism of this whole thing. This is really disturbing. But infidelity lurks in your genes, right? That's just where it is. That's, that's what's determining the neuroendocrinology, and that's what's determining. Look, this, I just put this up here. If you get a chance, look this article up because it has really hilarious quotations about it. I couldn't include them in the slides, and I'm a little upset about that. But love blocks pain. But this doesn't tell you the whole truth, because love actually blocks pain for 2 years. And then, and this is the phrase that they use this is from Stanford Medicine, by the way, then love leads to, and I'm not making this phrase up, it's in here, bone-crushing pain. Like, that's what, so for 2 years, no pain because of love. After 2 years, bone-crushing pain, okay? So that's what you've got to expect. So neuroscience and love it's a thing, right? It's a thing. Neuroscience has also been tied really heavily to economics, actually. Now there are studies that concern neuropeptides such as oxytocin and vasopressin, which, by the way, are the neuropeptides that are associated with love, pre-bone-crushing pain. But now there are these studies that relate to oxytocin and trust, okay? And so, for example, Paul Zak, who's at Claremont in California, has been conducting all this research on oxytocin levels and how it might influence how people trust one another and how they might trust certain products and certain corporations. And this is him, and this is his book, and I found this when I was looking for a picture of him, and I'm just going to read it to you, okay? A pioneer in the field of neuroeconomics, okay, good so far. Paul Zak is uncovering how the hormone oxytocin promotes trust and proving that love is good for business. Okay? It doesn't just promote trust, love is good for business.
For 2 years.
For 2 years. All right? Now, this is...
That looks like a singles ad, actually. That's on his Tinder. I heard about Tinder.
Yeah, I know. He's like, want some oxytocin? Yeah, he likes to really trust people.
Yeah.
So this is, and notice the subtitle of his book, The Moral Molecule, the source of love and prosperity.
I just have to notice here, Mark did a really careful study of the change in language from how scientists describe some of this stuff.
Dr. Clough?
Yes, are you going to...
Shameless plug. If you're interested in an in-depth criticism of Zak's work, you can read my essay, Neuropragmatic Reconstruction, a Case from Neuroeconomics, which is from this book, Pragmatist Neurophilosophy. This, by the way, is on my academia.edu page. You can find it for free and read it, okay? Well, and I've been noticing, by the way, this is funny, ever since this was advertised, I've been getting hits from Claremont, California. So, yeah.
Well,
this face might be reading my work.
But what you did so well is documenting how a lot he becomes complicit in all of this, and it's fairly easy to track, and I think it's quite clear on the previous slide that he's swallowed the,
You want to see him one more time?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
All right,
Very
so
good.
how does neuroscience relate to the dopamine democracy? Well, when neuroscientific explanations are utilized as truths within the market, so if we go all the way back to the New York Times and the Economist and all of the, I mean, you can see blogs that come out of Stanford and Harvard, and they're all talking, I mean, remember, I mean, let's face it, love is just chemical addiction, right? Remember? So when it becomes truths within the market, rather than being considered as experimental tools for addressing problems or parts of problems, read pragmatism here, they become normative and hegemonic, okay? So they come to actually dominate our discourse and dominate our beliefs and expectations. So in order for us to participate within the panoply of freedom that we're offered, to be a worthy stakeholder, we must abide by the correct standards that provide us with the means of following codes of conduct. This comes to include neuroscientific codes of conduct. So, since they explain the norms of behavior, correct notions of love, for instance, versus incorrect notions of love, each stakeholder actually becomes paradoxically responsible for altering her or his neuroscientific standards, right? Their basis, their neuroscientific profile, if you will. So what we're presented with is we're presented with neuroscientific explanations that in fact tell us, supposedly, what is the case. And yet, once we know what is the case, we're supposed to change what is the case, because now we know what is the case, but that's already been determined. So we get into this whole paradox that's very difficult to get out of and causes a lot of neuroses, I would say. So as Brown puts it, and I love this because it maps onto it so well, although, and I don't understand this, I have such a problem with authors who do this. It's 2015. What's with this term men? Like what? Like really? I mean, seriously, and that just, I have to point that out, that bothers me so much that in 2015, it's like, come on, Brown, like get a clue, you know, but, because that's just upsetting. But anyway, the neoliberal revolution takes place in the name of freedom, free markets, free countries, free people, but tears up freedom's grounding in sovereignty for states and subjects alike. So it seems as though everything is in the name of freedom, but really it's undermining freedom. So the neuroscientific explanations provide us with freedom, it seems, and yet we're confined by those freedoms. We're confined by the choices by which we're presented with. We in fact become what I call, and there's a typo on this, it should be by which we are, we become sites of scrutiny, by which we're valued or devalued in accordance with whatever neuroscientific profiles we have. This is Brown again. Human capital is constrained to self-invest. So what are you doing about your neuroscience? To self-invest in ways that contribute to its appreciation or at least prevent its depreciation. So we're not concerned with acquiring knowledge and experience needed for intelligent democratic citizenship. We're concerned with how we fit correct neuroscientific explanations. Am I doing what I need to be doing? Am I filling myself with the correct chemicals and doing what it takes to actually be a stakeholder, to be following the correct codes of conduct, if you will? So what good is all this neuroscientific knowledge then? Well, it quantifies experience. All human experience then can be framed within discourse that fits market principles. And as Henry Giroux states, if you have not read Giroux, he's absolutely wonderful, just a great public intellectual. One outcome of this dehumanizing value system is we refashion the self so that it not only provides this neurotic form of atomization, each person is isolated by their neuroscientific profile. I am just this autonomous individual, if you will. There's a disconnect from community. But also, it fosters this predatory culture of intolerance, cruelty, and abuse. Again, everything gets molded into a competitive marketplace according to market principles. And you can see this in the books that claim, I know.
Moody bitches.
Well, and I love this subject, the truth about the drugs you're taking, the sleep you're missing, the sex you're not having, and what's really making you crazy, right? This is going to tell you what's really going on with you. Or Dirty Minds, how our brains influence love, sex, and relationships. So these are just a little sample of the kind of packaging of neuroscience we're getting about what's right and what's wrong in terms of people. This is going to tell us, again, I mean, this term should not be neglected. This is the truth, right? This is actually what is the case, and this is highly problematic. So we're being supplied with these technologies of the self, if you will, that facilitate market growth while presenting us with the promise of freedom. But what kind of freedom are we being presented with? Are we actually being provided with freedom, or is this only an illusion of freedom? So, as Brown says, what the neoliberal solution is always to do is create more markets, more complete markets, more perfect markets. Everything comes down to consumption and ways to monetize. And this is, I would say, what's exactly going on with neuroscientific explanation. So within the dopamine democracy, as I put it, everything, including citizenship, is being redefined as a narrower set of consumer choices. And I think this becomes obvious when we look at things like presidential debates. It starts coming down to, I'm making a consumer choice. I'm not necessarily making an informed decision. I'm not making an informed democratic decision. What I'm doing is I'm buying into something. So these narrow consumer choices also include neuroscientific discourse. And this is really part of what I'm arguing here, is that the neuroscientific discourse is taken on as what's supposed to inform us of not only what's acceptable, but also what's good. It becomes normative. And so we, as individuals, become more marketable according to how we fit within the various discourses that map onto the market. As Michel Foucault put it, Homo politicus becomes Homo economicus. And again, I'm sorry about the gendered himself, but Homo economicus is an entrepreneur of, him or herself. And so this, I think, is just a vivid depiction of the dopamine democracy. And with this quotation from Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of the UK. Economics are the method, but the object is to change the soul. Yeah. So, what do I suggest here? Well, first of all, I think we need to engage in consistent, reflective criticism of discourse, of all types of discourse, and how it facilitates the illusion of freedom within this dopamine democracy. I think we need to fight against universal quantification. We need to hold on to qualities and not let everything, including things, and I'll just make, I guess a controversial claim here, including pedagogy, including turning all of pedagogy into quantification in terms of things like assessment. We need to use neuro and other sciences and tools, but be wary of falling into scientific or market reductionism. We can't or we shouldn't look at everything as being reducible to scientific discourse or to market principles or market language. And finally, we need to be wary of complacency or settling for market conceptions of freedom. We need to continue using and improving upon philosophical tools that help work on other tools and techniques. So we need to be philosophical, I believe, in our approach to these things and not fall into this trap of getting sucked into this idea that, oh, look, I have all these choices, and thereby I'm necessarily free. And look, things like neuroscience are just providing the answers that I need. Neuroscience is an incredibly useful tool, but it's not the only tool. And I think the scary thing is, if we look at scientific journalism, it's becoming one of the only acceptable tools. And so I think we need to stand back and begin to understand it, but also begin to criticize it and criticize how it's being applied. Thank you.